Hi, today I'll show you how I made a gouache illustration that I prepared for download as a free coloring page for subscribing to my newsletter. You can find the download link in the video description below. It is snowy and white outside, truly a Christmas mood, perfect for our theme. To accompany me, all you need to do is download and print the coloring page. If you are coloring with color pencils, plain thin paper will do, but if you are taking up gouache or watercolor, I recommend thicker paper. In this case, choose one of the lighter versions of the coloring page, sepia or light gray. This way the printer will use less ink in printing and there is less risk that the ink will smear when you start using water. If you don't have a printer, you can trace the image from your computer screen, or if you have an iPad, use the free Lightbox app, making it easier to transfer it to paper. Once you have set the desired size of the image, just press the lock icon. Turn off the light, you will see the pattern more clearly. If you do it during the day, do not despair, just cover yourself with a blanket. I use an HB automatic pencil with a red insert to transfer the image. I would like B or 2B much more since they are softer and more pleasant to draw, but I haven't found it in Polish art stores. I'm not very precise when redrawing my picture. I only care about outlining the most important elements. If you prefer, do it more precisely. And don't worry if any line comes out crooked or too thick. The sketch will be covered with layers of gouache anyway. Before painting, I made a color sketch on the iPad in the Infinite Painter app. I planned to use typical Christmas color red and green, which are contrasting colors. They compete for attention. To avoid this, I complement them with oranges and shades of pink by planning a harmonious palette, and I use greens in the background. Red hats of gnomes should be the main accents. I chose the textured watercolor paper. I reached for my Talens gouaches. Purchased about 4 years ago, the paints have dried out in jars, but they can still be reactivated with water, although it's more difficult to get a creamy paint consistency. We'll see what we can squeeze out of them yet. Meanwhile, I'm slowly looking around for new gouaches. Okay, I'm starting to paint. I began by painting the stars with clear water. I wanted to preserve the brightness of the paper, especially around the stars to mimic their glow. When I added the paint, the color spreads over the wet surface without flowing into the dry areas. I added a large amount of water to the light green paint, so the gouache behaves like watercolor and creates transparent layers, and the colors blend together to form gradients. Unfortunately, I have concerns about most of Talens' green colors. They are very bright and not very natural looking. In later stages, they will mess up my concept of backgrounds in calm green tones. On a small paper sizes and in the early stages, I like to use a flat brush. The wider part allows you to paint larger areas with thicker strokes, while the narrow one leaves thin lines. I wanted to try out a recently purchased cheap brush. The first use left no doubt that the quality went hand in hand with the price. But that's okay, I won't feel bad about using it later to apply varnish, and it is quite destructive for brushes. I'm trying to calm the sharpness of the green with a touch of red and warm grey. I'm trying to leave the stars unpainted, but I already know they will need touching up and bringing out their shape with the white paint in the later stages. I paint the inside of the toadstool frame with the bubbles inside. I don't want them to distract from the gnome figures, so they will all be in similar shades. To make the colors not too intense, I'm adding grey and white to pink, carmine and purple. Here we can observe another feature of gouaches, the change of color during drying. During the application of the paint, we see the color more intense than after drying. In addition, by its uneven drying, it often looks really bad. For example, at this point. In addition, I start to suspect that this green is still too vivid, and I feel like leaving it all. And that means it's time for a break. To enjoy the winter landscape, as the snow is about to run off with mud and rain as fast as I am at the moment on my butt directly into the river, classy winter swimming performed by me. I'm starting with accent colors, that is reds turning into oranges. I'm painting heads, a bubble, a toadstool ornament with them. A later combination of yellow and orange will be on the skirt and pants. These are Polish folk costumes in the Gouache style. Also, I've changed the brush to a round pointed synthetic one. I wanted to paint more details with it, but it quickly turns out not to be precise enough. So I immediately replace it with a thinner one, but it still lacks the sharpness for facial details. This is interesting because with watercolor paints, both of these brushes work great when painting details. With the more creamy paint, however, I miss the accuracy. I'm adding a bleach purple to the inside of the frame to calm a bit colors down. As it dries, we can again see the paint initially getting darker and getting lighter as it dries. Extremely tricky. Time for my favorite brush. It's a thin type with a very long tip. I'm adding some red to the heads to make sure it will be the sharpest color in this image. For a long time I had no confidence in this type. I thought it would be too flexible and the bristle would not hold together. I try to use very thin and short brushes to paint fine lines instead, but that has changed since I gave this one with a long tip a chance. It is exactly because of it that it paints lines smoothly and precisely. I'm adding more and more details, stripes on dresses, stripes on pants, single strands of hair, facial details. I'll also mention how I painted the faces of the gnomes. I used diluted flesh-colored paint first. This allows the brightness of the paper to shine through from under the layer of paint, which gives the faces a lot of lightness. When I paint with gouache, I often have an internal battle whether to keep the transparent layers in some areas or cover them with more opaque paint. And whichever solution I decide on, I usually later wonder if would not have been better to choose the second option after all. This time I added more paint and the skin lost its lightness, but it is consistent with the rest of the picture. The implementation of acrylic gouache for painting white elements is one of my favorite moments. After it dries, just like acrylic and unlike regular gouache, we can't reactivate it with water again. For a struggle with the color green, I changed back to a thicker brush. I don't want to have too much detail in the batch of green twigs as to avoid distracting from the characters. In retrospect, I regret that I darkened the green background so much. On the other hand, this created a contrast between the dark background and the lighter border that frames the characters, which I consider a benefit. I introduced further details with sharply pointed watercolor pencils. They have the property that they are soft. Thanks to that, it is easy to draw on the dried paint with them. I also made a mistake of framing the star shapes with yellow decorative paint. I used it for the first time. I thought it would be more opaque and luminous. Meanwhile, it is quite thin and only glossy. I wasn't satisfied with the effect, so I then painted over those parts with light green gouache. And that was lots of unnecessary work. And that's how it happens in the process of painting. Not everything can be predicted, different things can surprise us, sometimes positively, and that's exciting, but it's also hard to avoid all mistakes. And I guess that's not the point. I think it's worth accepting that they happen. Only on sped up time lapses do we see the magical emergence of illustration without mistakes at the snap of a finger. Meanwhile, each illustration is a process that lasts for hours, during which, more than once, I feel like throwing with a brush and rushing into the woods to join the pack of wolves. Sometimes I feel this way. The final touches are mainly fixing the shapes of the stars with white acrylic gouache. And the final phase is to paint the illustration with matte varnish for watercolor paints, which also works well for gouache. Every time I lay down a layer of it, I tremble with fear that the brush will smudge the paint underneath. But it never does, so I assume it is safe, I guess. It's not necessary, but it protects the work well against fading, and in the case of gouaches, it also has a great effect on the colors, and it's magical. I love to see how, thanks to the varnish, the colors of gouaches gain depth and saturation, They also become darker. It's not exactly what I would want for a green background. Fortunately, the reds and oranges have also become juicy and are still the main accent. I am also glad that I used white paint to separate contrasting colors from each other. In this way, they are not in the direct competition and the color scheme seems to be more matched. Red and green is a difficult theme, but I hope that despite this uneven battle, I managed to wrap it up by introducing harmonious colors and white. For the future, I will be very careful with Talens greens, especially in pure form. And really, the last touch, the scan and final adjustment in Photoshop. I fixed accidental splashes, corrected the details a bit, and did color correction. Interestingly, I wanted to mute the greens, but in the end I left them in a form very close to original. You can fix a lot digitally. Even traditional works often undergo such a treatment, and usually only the best successful or corrected version we watch on the internet. This gives the false impression that others do not make mistakes. I think it's too rarely said that without mistakes there is no learning, so let's make them courageously and try to learn from them. Yay! Finally, let me remind you, coloring page for download is in the link in the description of the video, and if you found this useful, please let me know, comment, like, subscribe. But even if there is no response, be warned that I will certainly make another one because I like it. So see you later.